All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Professor Jordan. My name is Jerry Friedman. I'm an attorney. I mostly sue the government for misconduct. So when you see police pulling people out of cars a little too violently, that's the kind of litigation I get involved with. I've sued, right now I'm in a lawsuit against the FBI. They arrested my client. They knew he was innocent, but they put him in prison for 2 years for smuggling heroin. He was acquitted at trial. The jury said he didn't do it, and now we're suing them for taking 2 years of his life away, essentially. Before that, I became interested in animals very much. I had a strong affinity to animals. I went to Golden View School in Huntington Beach, which had a little environmental learning facility, which is about 2 acres, where they had rabbits and chickens and pigs and turkeys and tortoises. And through my childhood, I had this really strong bond with non-human animals. And the first career I wanted to be, when I was 10 years old, I decided I wanted to be a veterinarian. I actually went to pre-veterinary school in biology to become a veterinarian. And that's a lot of my science background here. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a science professor, but I've always been interested in science. And sometime after college, I decided to become a lawyer and be able to advocate. We can't advocate for animals in the courts because they're not persons. You can't take your dog to court and say somebody beat the dog. So what I do instead, I try to advocate for humans like you who are advocating for animals. So my presentation here is called Brain Envy, and the discussion is about how, well, we have cheetahs, right? Cheetahs are the fastest land animals. We have whales, who are the largest animals in the ocean. And as humans think about all the animals on the planet seem to have some sort of specialty. But what's the specialty of humans? And so at some point when humans were thinking about this question, the answer came out, well, we have a very big brain. And so you may have heard of Sigmund Freud, right? You've heard of Sigmund Freud? Yeah. And Sigmund Freud came up with an expression called penis envy, which means that everybody, men and women, they want a big penis. So what I do is I turn this over to brain envy, and the idea is that humans, we like ourselves for our brain. It's like, look how big our brain is. And this is humans' contribution to the natural world. So my presentation is about the brain envy, and specifically why eating meat did not cause the human brain to grow, which we'll go into. The intuitive issue that came to me was that there are so many animals, carnivores, who eat abundant meat, up to 100% of their diet, and yet they don't seem to have large brains. So when there was this idea that eating meat caused the human brain to grow, when I was asked this question, it didn't sit right. And so the silly picture here is we have a lion with a book, and we just don't see that. But this idea came from the transition from, we have the last common ancestor that we share with chimpanzees with a fairly small brain, and it started growing with Homo habilis, and it kept on growing to modern day humans. Our research of the paleontological record also showed that we had very little meat eating way back when. And somewhere in the middle, we started getting more meat eating, and we have a lot of meat eating now. And so we have this correlation. We have two things that are spanning the same time together, and these scientists who did not have much evidence, this was 150 years ago, 100 years ago, not much evidence yet, they just saw that these two things correlate, and they would say, well, because of this correlation, we have causation. You may have heard the expression that correlation does not imply causation. As an example, let's say a random 2 of you go from this class to the next class together. Every day, you go to the same class together. People see you walking together every day. We have correlation. Does that mean you're dating? So just because we have 2 things that correlate, and we might think, well, people who walk together, they're probably dating. Just because we have correlation, it doesn't mean that because you walk together, you're dating. It's one step too far. It could be coincidence, and in this case, it is kind of coincidence. All right. Another way to express this, so the idea here of the increased meat consumption, or what what benefits does eating meat have? The idea was that when you're looking at predators, when you're looking at hunters, trying to stalk your prey, that causes mental activity. You have to be smart to outsmart your prey. And also for humans developing tools, in this case we have a spear, that's mental innovation. We're having mental stimulation. And so here's this push that we have for a larger brain. And at the same time, meat has a lot of calories, right? You chew on lettuce, you don't get many calories. You chew on meat, you get a lot of fat, a lot of calories. And so this was their correlation. This was their trying to figure out how these elements come together. Another way to express it is a positive feedback loop. So the more we hunt, the more meat we get a larger brain. Well, you have a larger brain now, you can do more things. You become a better hunter. Okay? Well, you're a better hunter now, you're going to get more meat. You get more meat, you get a larger brain. So this is the positive feedback loop that they observed. But again, how does this relate to the whole rest of the animal kingdom? How large is the brain of a shark? How large is the brain of an alligator? Why don't these predators have large brains? Why don't we have dinosaurs out in space? This just didn't make sense to me. So let's take it a step farther. Let's talk about the paradigms and prejudice. This is the framework that these scientists were operating under. Lear Keith actually is not a scientist, but I found this quote from her. She was vegetarian, and she said she had health problems as vegetarian, so she started eating meat. She wrote a book, and she started getting so much attention because, wow, we've got a vegetarian who's not vegetarian anymore, and so people were really promoting her. So she was interviewed about her book. This was an interview on the peak moment in 2011, and she says that you could go back 4 million years to the very beginning of the human race. Well, how far back does the human race go? Do you cover that? So the human race depends upon what we define as human. There's some wiggle room there. Humans like you and me go back maybe 250,000 years. If we go back to the origin of the species, the genus of Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and so forth, we're getting closer to about 4 million years, 5 million years. And so she's saying for the last 4 million years to the very beginning of the human race, so this is back Homo habilis, who were short, there was no question that we were hunters. This is what we ate for literally 4 million years, and it's the reason why we have really big brains. So I have seen this expression in scientific journals, in regular journals. There's a Scientific American article I read a couple of years ago, which all points to the same idea, even though in the scientific communities, as I'll discuss, but in the scientific communities, this idea is pretty much debunked. This is not true, but there are still people in public who are perpetuating this, and that's partly why I'm presenting this to you, so you don't perpetuate it. All right. So these are the operative paradigms. There's anthropocentrism, there is speciesism, and there's carnism. Are any of you familiar with these terms, or do you want to take a stab at what they mean? What's anthropocentrism? What's anthro? Anthro is human, centrism, centered, human-centered. Anthropocentrism says that only the human perspective matters. An example of anthropocentrism, the universe was created for us. We have an enormous universe of unimaginable size, but the reason the universe is here is because of humans, human-centered. Inside of anthropocentrism, we have speciesism. Does anybody want to say what speciesism is? Think about sexism, racism, ageism. What is speciesism?
I think humans are better than all other species out there.
It's very good. It's very good. It is discrimination against other species, pretty much because they're not human. So racism is discrimination against other races because they're not your race. So human interests are more important than other interests, okay? And then finally we have carnism, and you've heard of veganism, right? Veganism is the idea that we should be eating plants. Carnism is the idea that we should be eating meat. As we go through this presentation, I believe that most of the scientists who support the meat-brain theory, they are anthropocentrists, they are speciesists, and they are carnists. and that filters their perspective. These are some of the examples of the scientists who have put our science the way it is, who have positioned our science the way it is, particularly as it goes to the topic that I'm discussing. We have Aristotle on the left. He said that lower life forms were created to serve humans. And I say he said that, I don't think he said that quote, that's what he meant. So for example, every animal in the world exists for humans. What was his reason for saying that fleas exist? What possible reason would fleas exist for humans? They didn't have alarm clocks back then. A flea exists to bite you and wake you up in the morning. So his idea was that every animal exists for us. René Descartes famously taught about nailing live dogs and cats to wooden boards and dissecting them alive. And they would scream. And René Descartes said, I agree, these dogs and cats, they're suffering, but their suffering is different than our suffering. Their suffering is like a machine, like a clock. And a clock operates, it moves, but there's no moral meaning to that. When a human suffers, it's bad. When a dog suffers, it doesn't matter. Raymond Dart, as you can see here with some primitive skulls, some paleontological skulls, some fossils, he was one of the original writers behind the meat-brain theory, meat-brain hypothesis. And his perspective was that humans became civilized through hunting meat, and it's what I was presenting to you earlier. So he was one of the first people to present this idea in the, I believe around late 1800s, early 1900s, 1930s come to mind, and that's sort of the seed of the idea, and the idea went forward from that point. So how do we guard against these prejudices? How do we guard against anthropocentrism? How do we guard against speciesism and carnism in science? So there were some people who believed that there were cyclops. We've got a cyclops here. And the reason they believed that there were cyclopses was because they found a skull with a giant eye socket in the middle. They've got one data point, and they said there's a cyclops. Does anybody recognize this skull?
Not a dwarf elephant skull.
It is an elephant skull. So what they mistook as where the trunk is rooted, they thought that was an eye socket. We have a cyclops. They have one data point, and they made a whole mythology around the cyclops. So to move this forward into good science, what do we want? We want more data. The more data, observation and evidence, the more data we have, the more we can tease out what it is we're analyzing. If we have one data point, not so good. If we have 100 data points, it's pretty good. There's an accumulation of data. We also want rational argument. There are fallacies, which I'll be discussing later. We want to stay away from those fallacies. We want to stay away from irrational argument. And finally, we want peer review, which means no matter how good we think we are, we know we're right. We want other smart people to look at it. We don't want to be in love with our ideas because they're our ideas. We want to be in love with our ideas because they're true. So an easy example here is, what are wings for? We have the wings of a bat. We have wings of a bird. Same data points, metacarpals, fingers, elbows, and they're both used for flying, right? So if you see a wing, it means that the animal flies. Is that true? Why not? I can't hear you. Well, there's penguin. You are a great peer reviewer. And so some people are so focused. They're so focused on their ideas. And I have the answer. And then somebody comes up and says, what about penguins? What about ostriches? So to guard against these prejudices, we need to have more data, not just the eye socket. We need rational argument, and we need peer review. Taking this at a more legal perspective, if you have two thumbprints, you have the thumbprint of who you think did it, and you have a thumbprint at the scene of the crime. The FBI says you need more than one match in the pattern. Anybody want to guess how many matches makes for a good thumbprint match? How many points? 6? More. Anybody else? 20 less? 10, so 14 is what the FBI says. FBI says 14. If you have 14 matches on 2 different thumbprints, it is statistically impossible that it comes from 2 different people. It has to be the same person. Now, statistically impossible means, well, it's still possible, but probably it's impossible. 14 data points. So once again, think about the eye socket. Once again, think about these 2 parallel lines of correlation going up. We want more data than that. Richard Leakey is a paleoanthropologist whom I respect very much, and he encapsulates what I'm talking about here. He actually does the research that I'm talking about. All scientists work from some sort of a theoretical framework and interpret evidence in its light. So they have a prejudice, they have a bias. It doesn't mean it's bad, it just means that because of their environment, because of their schooling, because of their observations, they already have some assumptions before they start research. Weak evidence can often be made to fit such a framework, whatever its form. I've seen that happen many times in paleoanthropology today. My purpose is not to say that scientists are bad. My purpose is to say that scientists make assumptions and we need to look for those assumptions. Obviously, we wouldn't have science class here were it not for scientists. There's a lot of things we wouldn't enjoy. So when you hear me being critical of scientists, I'm not attacking the scientific community. I'm saying that we need to look at the assumptions, we need to challenge the assumptions, and we need to get rid of the bad science. All right. I talked about rational argument. These are some of the arguments, these are some of the logical fallacies that we're going to be encountering in my presentation. Have any of you been taking any kind of logic classes or philosophy classes? Fantastic. I took an introduction to logic class at El Camino College, your competitor, and it changed my world. It made me think better. Highly recommend anybody who wants to think better take an introduction to logic class and go farther. You'll learn about fallacies, you'll be a better thinker, you'll be a better student, you'll be a better parent, you'll be a better consumer, you'll be a better. The burden of proof is on the affirmative. That means if somebody makes a claim, that person has to prove it. The earth goes around the sun, prove it. The sun goes around the earth, prove it. Whoever makes the affirmative claim is the one who has to prove that. If somebody says that meat caused the brain to grow, it is for them to prove it. It's not for me to disprove it. They have to prove what they say for us to believe it. The argument from ignorance. I don't know how it happened. It must have been meat. I don't know how the brain grew. Meat sounds right. A sampling bias means you don't have enough data. And the biggest sampling bias, well, that's not entirely true. I'll explain that. The most obvious sampling bias is when you have one example in your data set, right? The elephant skull. N equals 1. You have one sample. Sampling bias is also when you kind of control your research so that you get the results you want. I'm studying a very big topic, but I'm just going to look at this data here. I'm going to bias my sampling so I know what kind of conclusion I'm going to get. Correlation does not imply causation, which we spoke about earlier. Confirmation bias is similar to sampling bias. Confirmation bias is, so sampling bias is kind of before the fact. I'm going to control my data. Confirmation bias is after the fact. I knew that was what I was going to get. I know that spirits like me because when I see a green light, I can go through the intersection. I know spirits like me because when there's a good parking place, it's the spirits who are giving me a good parking place. And so it's observing something that confirms your assumption and you say, hey, this is it. So it's my confirmation bias. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy is one of my favorites. And that is starting with the conclusion and working back to make your analysis fit your conclusion. The Texas sharpshooter shoots the side of a barn and he draws the target around it. Fantastic. And so the same idea, if you know the result you want, this is what Richard Leakey was talking about. You know the result you want, you will frame your analysis and your data to draw a bullseye around the target you already shot. And durability bias is a little more scientific and a little less on the rational side. But a durability bias means that over time, over the millions of years of human evolution, some things last longer than others. And because of that, we have more evidence of some types and less evidence of different types. A good example, think about what you eat day to day. Now let's go to a different college from 100 years ago, no, we'll have to do it the other way around. We're going to go 100 years in the future and go to a college and look at the trash that the students left at the cafeteria. And if you look through trash that's been there for 100 years, you're going to see soda cans, but you're not going to see pizzas. And so the durability bias says that after 100 years, after 1,000 years, after 1,000,000 years, the things that are left behind are going to prejudice our analysis because we have the soda cans and we might think that students drink a lot of soda, but we're never going to see the pizza because it's not durable. Okay. So even if we have physical evidence from millions of years ago, we still have to remember maybe not everything turned into a fossil, maybe not everything was a chipped rock that we can look at today. There might be some things that are not here, and we have to still remain light on our feet and understand that not everything turns into a fossil. So what use is the brain anyway? The scarecrow didn't need it. What other life forms don't need a brain?
Single-cell organisms.
Single-cell organisms, bacteria, protozoa. I heard jellyfish, so we have brain-free and carefree. We have plants. Plants don't have a brain. Plants have been around a lot longer than we have. They seem to survive just fine without brains. And we don't want to forget the fungus kingdom and our single-cell organisms. So brains, for the span of life, really aren't that important. There are animals without brains, sea sponge, no brain, no nervous system. We have jellyfish. Jellyfish have nerves, but no brain. So we don't know if they think, how they think. We don't know what it's like to be without a brain, but they have nerves. I will give $10 to anybody who knows this animal. And this is the sea squirt, one of my favorite animals ever. The sea squirt, as a juvenile, as you are, the sea squirt juvenile has a brain. They look maybe like a tadpole swimming through the ocean. When they become adults, they say, we don't need a brain anymore. They will actually attach themselves to something, and they eat their own brain, and then they just filter food. So if you ever meet an adult who you think has a bad attitude, just call them a sea squirt. All right? In the animal kingdom, brains have a huge advantage, but they're not essential. Some animals have a very small brain and they do just fine. And who is that? Homer Simpson, good. Some animals have a large brain and they do just fine. Does anybody know this movie? Almost. I heard something else. Mars Attacks. So the Martians have this very big brain. The Martians ended up losing, so their big brain didn't do that well. Sorry to give the movie away. I'll be talking about two evolutionary principles, and this is one of the very important principles with the brain, and talking about brain size is energy conservation. So the idea is that if you have two different animals, here we go. If you have two different animals, if you have a group of animals, in that population, some will have just naturally a slightly larger brain and some will have a slightly smaller brain. It's just the way that mutation works and genes work. There's always going to be variation. Somebody's going to be taller, somebody's going to be shorter, somebody's going to be faster, somebody's going to be slower. Somebody's going to have a larger brain, somebody's going to have a smaller brain. If there is a condition where you don't have enough energy, which means if there's not enough food, you want a smaller everything. You want a smaller brain, you want a smaller body. If there's less energy, you want to conserve that energy, and the smaller survives. But if, for some reason, that larger brain gives you an advantage, that advantage will translate into you will be more likely to reproduce. You'll be more likely to have children, and your children will have those larger brain genes. And your children will have an advantage, maybe, and they reproduce, and their children have larger brains. And so only when a system will confer some sort of a survival advantage can that really push up against that energy conservation. Does a larger brain help you survive better? Does a larger brain help you eat more food? Does a larger brain help you reproduce and have children? And so in this example, as I said, in a population, if there's a lot of food, and if there's a lot of food, there's not going to be any pressure on brain size, and you're not going to see much difference because everybody's eating well enough, okay? If there's not a lot of food, the people with a smaller brain on the sides are going to have an advantage, unless there's not a lot of food, but her larger brain gives her some advantage, and because her larger brain gives her some advantage, then she's going to reproduce better. And when you do this generation after generation after generation, you see that the brain size gets larger and larger and larger. And so we know in human history over the last several million years, there was a restriction of food, and those animals, those ancestors of ours with a larger brain, slightly larger brain, got bigger and bigger and bigger. Some examples of meat-eater brains. I tried to focus on Africa because we're talking about evolutionary human history. I have a few examples outside of Africa. But the lion's brain is about 240 grams. If you look at the ratio between the lion's brain and the lion's body, it's at a 0.8 ratio. And that number will be more meaningful as we go on. Spotted hyena, their brain is 160 grams, and their brain ratio is 0.4. Gray wolf, 120 grams, 0.3. Grizzly bear, 234 grams, and 0.004. And so even at this point, I highlight these two brain sizes because it looks like these two brain sizes, these two animals should be about the same intelligence if we think that the same brain is about the same intelligence. Do we have any idea if lions are smarter than grizzly bears or if grizzly bears are smarter than lions? Any idea? You put a lion in the environment of a grizzly bear, the lion won't do that well. You put a grizzly bear in the environment of a lion, the grizzly bear won't do that well. Intelligence has a lot to do with the environment that they're in, and it's very difficult, if even possible, to compare. House cat brain is 30 grams, alligator 8.5 grams. And you can see compared to the body size, the alligator's body is extremely large and their brain is extremely small compared to their body. For comparison, Australopithecus afarensis has a 2.2 brain to body ratio. These are our ancient ancestors, which I'll discuss more in a bit. And humans were at about 7.5. And so it just means that the size of our brain compared to our body is much, much larger. Our brain is much, much larger than all of these meat eaters. And in fact, every meat eater, there's one exception. Every meat eater I know has a larger, the human brain is proportionately larger than every other meat eater except for one, which is Peter's bottlenose elephant nose, Peter's elephant nose fish. There's a small fish who has a huge brain and a little body. Only meat eater with a larger brain body ratio than humans that I've heard of. Even bottlenose dolphins, very intelligent animals, very large brain, meat eaters, but their body is much, much larger compared to their brain than humans. So if we compare this over to plant eaters, we have a tree shrew who has a huge brain compared to their body size, but their brain is only 3 grams. It's pretty small. The elephant has a huge brain, but compared to their body size, it's pretty small. And we have horses and other animals which are all around 1 and 1/2. The hippopotamus has a pretty big brain, size of a horse, but their body is so much larger, so the ratio is so much smaller. And again, for comparison, Australopithecus afarensis and Homo sapiens. Now notice the highlights. Humans do not have the largest brain, and we do not have the largest ratio. And so it's hard to say, is the size of the brain more important? Is the comparative size of the brain more important? There are plenty of examples in the animal kingdom where humans are not on top. So what is it that makes a better brain? Between men and women, who has a larger brain, typically? Close. Men typically have a larger brain. Does that mean that men are more intelligent? Guys, don't say anything. Does that mean that men are more intelligent because men typically have a larger brain? No. Brain-body ratio. Women typically have a larger brain compared to body size because women are typically smaller. Does that make women more intelligent? Well, it's the same answer, right? No. So just because of the size of the brain and because of the ratio of the brain, you cannot correlate that to say that they're more intelligent. Another issue, European versus non-European. Who has the larger brain on average? Europeans tend to have a larger brain. I will give you a hint. Same answer. Does that mean Europeans are more intelligent? Why do you think that Europeans have a larger brain on average than non-Europeans? The European persons are smaller? That's a great guess. So I haven't heard this discussed very much. My opinion, Europe gets pretty cold, and our brain needs to stay a certain temperature. And so European brains have more fat. Now, the scientists 100 years ago, full of different prejudices, they didn't think about this. They thought Europeans had a bigger brain. Of course, Europeans are smarter. But there's a lot of fat in the brain, and so if somebody gives you that argument, you can just call them a fat brain, however you want to put it. So, who is the smartest animal if brain size matters? Elephants are up there. Sperm whales probably have a gigantic brain, huge brain. Who is the smartest if the ratio matters? Tree shrew probably has the largest ratio, but we don't see them in outer space. And the other reasons for an increased brain size, probably fat, probably insulation, probably want to keep the brains warm. There's an expression, it sounds different these days, but there's an expression, don't blow your brains out. It doesn't refer to a gun. It refers to when people are sneezing and a lot of mucus and phlegm is coming out, don't blow your brains out. People used to think a long time ago that the brain made phlegm. And so when you're sneezing like crazy, so that idea has been debunked, but just so you know how the evolution of these ideas came. All right. So talking about quality versus quantity, when the paleoanthropologists are looking at the brain cases, the skulls of our ancient ancestors, and they look at how the brain would fit inside those skulls, and they see the areas of the brain case that changed. The area, as the human brain was growing, the area that changed the most was the frontal lobe. It grew both in absolute terms and in proportion to the rest of the brain. It became much more massive than the rest of the brain. And so it's not a question of a bigger brain makes us balance better. It's not a question of a bigger brain regulates our internal organs better. The question is that that bigger frontal lobe goes to planning and problem solving and sensory interpretation and a more sophisticated understanding of the world. And so maybe we can think about it as it helped our ancestors go from kind of a two-dimensional world to more of a three-dimensional world. I'm just talking mentally, I'm not talking actually. Mentally, maybe it helped our ancestors go from a black and white world to more of a color world. It is just a more enriching experience to understand the way that the world works. We don't have any examples of these older brains. This is just my own assumption, my own belief. All right, let's go into the human story. The second evolutionary principle, the second EC that I want you to think about is called evolutionary commitment. Evolutionary commitment means that the farther a species evolves in a certain direction, the harder it is for that species to change. Species will not just back up, turn around, and go a different direction on a whim. The example of the penguin is penguins still have wings. Instead of penguins evolving fins, they just use their wings to swim. So as a bird, penguins are committed to having wings, and they just adapt. So the more invested a species is, more time in a certain way of living, the harder it is for that species to change. This is everybody's great, 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 great 1,000 times grandmother. This is Plesiadapis. She lived about 55 million years ago, give or take, and she fed on fruits and leaves. So going from about 55 million years ago, so the dinosaurs died 65 or so, dinosaurs died around here, Plesiadapis around here. So moving fast forward in time, we branch off to orangutans who split from our line 13 million years ago, Gorillas split from our line 9 million years ago. Chimpanzees split from our line 6 million years ago. So as we go through this entire span, we have fruits, leaves over here. We have fruits, leaves, and grass over here. So we understand between these 2 points, our ancestors have been eating fruits, leaves, grass for millions and millions and millions and millions of years. And our bodies, our evolutionary body, the way that our body works is heavily invested in eating fruits, plants, and not so much grass. That has tapered off. This is our last common ancestor, again, about 6 million years ago. The 6 is covered up. The brain case, the brain size, this number is about the same because pretty much the brain fills up the whole case. The case is just a little larger. Is about 350 cubic centimeters. A little bit later, we have Australopithecines at 450 cubic centimeters. So we have a growth of about 29%. So this is where we start seeing growth, and I've marked that with a star. This is where we start seeing a significant growth of 29%. We go a little farther in the future, we have Homo habilis, 800, almost twice as much, well, 129% of last common ancestor, but we see we go from 450 to 800, we're going larger and larger. Homo erectus. Homo erectus had the same body size as you and I do, but their brains were smaller. They were at about 1,100 cubic centimeters. And we actually have Neanderthals, blossomed up to 1,500 cubic centimeters. Very big brain. On the same timeline, the very first physical evidence we have of our ancestors eating meat is at 3.4 million years ago. And that's a few bones that have some tool marks on them. One data point at 3.4. So we know that here, one of our ancestors started gnawing on bones. This was after our brain started to grow. The second data point is a little over 2 million years ago. And so if we have one data point here, one data point here, sure, there's data points in the middle, but it's not much. There's just no evidence. Controlled fire started around here. We have some hearths in Kenya with different types of wood that were brought together from a lot of different places and charcoaled. And so it's not a natural fire because it got all these different types of wood. And so what does this mean? But there certainly weren't cooking animals here and they weren't cooking animals here. We don't know if there were cooking animals here. We could be cooking plants as well. And then spears are not developed until here. And even though spears are developed here, these are not throwing spears. These are jabbing spears. We haven't figured out how to throw them yet. Could be defensive, could be to scare away a predator. We don't know. I have another star here, which is foreshadowing of when we started to eat a lot of meat. So the evidence says from scavenging here to this star here, very little meat. And at this point, meat intake starts to go up. So I'm shifting the slide over a little bit. We're at 600,000 years ago here. This is the point of spears at 500,000 years ago. We have Homo erectus again. We have the big brainy Neanderthals. We have archaic humans. This is our ancestors 200,000 years ago, give or take. Their brains were about the same size as the Neanderthal. And here we are, and our brain shrunk. 20,000 years ago, our brain started to shrink. Imagine that. So we have full-scale hunting here at 50,000 years ago. So the brain's been getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and now we're actually eating substantial meat. Substantial, we don't know how much that is. There is a tribe now in Africa called the Hadze, H-A-D-Z-E tribe. They have modern weapons, which to us means they have bows, arrows, and poison. They have the modern human brain. Their hunting only brings back about 5% calories for the diet of the community. So when they're foraging for ground vegetables, when they're foraging for fruits and nuts, that composes 95% of the diet. The very best hunters, the very best Hadza tribes, they only bring back about 5%. And so we can infer that at 50,000 years ago, before we had bows and arrows, before we had poison, we probably were not hitting that 5% mark. But I'm putting that here in perspective, that when I'm saying full-scale hunting, full-scale optimistically is 5% of bringing back animals to eat. It's not the pictures of woolly mammoths with proto-humans tearing off big pieces because they came back from a kill. All right. Oh, and agriculture started around 10,000 years ago. So the shrinkage of the human brain started before we started raising our own crops. I'm putting the two scales together here. Encephalization is the increased size of a human brain, of any brain. So we see that encephalization has been going up from our ancient grandmother to our last common ancestor. It got up to about this point, and then something happened here, and it shot up and it shrank. Whereas the meat eating went much later, and then it shot up. And I put 50% here. If anybody here, half their diet is meat, then you're part of this 50% category. And that's, of course, because we have farms and we raise animals and we don't hunt them anymore because we put them in cages and we just take their meat when we want to. This is not the savanna hunters. What's most important here is that the human brain started to evolve much, 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 much earlier, started to grow much earlier than we started eating a significant amount of meat. These are what some of the experts say about the data, and these are the experts who I disagree with. This is Leslie Aiello. She's from the United Kingdom. She says that the incorporation of increasingly greater amounts of animal products into the diet was essential in the evolution of the large human brain. She's one of the reasons why I've made this presentation. Another expert. Without meat, it's unlikely that proto-humans could have secured enough energy. We're talking about calories and nutrition, other nutrients from the plants available in their African environment at that time to evolve into the active, sociable, intelligent creatures they became. Now, I put unlikely in red because Catherine Milton is a little more qualified, whereas Leslie Aiello says it was essential. So she gives no room for argument, but Catherine Milton says, well, there might be another explanation. It's unlikely. Henry Bunn just says meat made us human. He wrote an article titled Meat Made Us Human, and he talks about why. No equivocation. So let's look at the physical evidence. This was Henry Bunn's article that I read. So the Olduvai Gorge is a famous digging site in Africa. And it's one of the reasons why it's famous is because they say it was remarkably well preserved. So there were humans that were living in this gorge and around this gorge, this big hole in the, big hole in the ground, giant hole in the ground. And there was some volcanic activity, and ash and mud and soot covered that gorge. And so now that we are coming back there and we're starting to pull things out, it is remarkably well preserved because that volcanic ash preserved it. So in his digging, so the relics that he found are from about 2 million years ago. That's about Homo erectus. From his digging in this remarkably well-preserved site, they found a minimum of 48 large animals. Large animals could be some of the water oxen out there, the wildebeests, some of the larger African animals, maybe elephants. Actually, I remember they parsed it out. I recall that there was a hippopotamus in there. I think there was one elephant in there. There were even some human bones, which may suggest cannibalism. So they said that from 2 million years ago, there were a minimum of 48. And they accumulated over several years. They didn't say what several years are. So I'm generously saying several years is 5 years. It could be 50 years. We're talking 2 million years ago. We don't know how much several years are. But I'm generously saying 48 animals in 5 years, about 50 animals in about 5 years. It means about 10 large animals per year, which is about 1 large animal per month. The problem I have of his conclusion that meat made us human, is because first, there's no evidence of universality. So we have this evidence here in the Olduvai Gorge. We don't know if maybe there was an exception here. What if large animals came to this Olduvai Gorge and they were killed in the Olduvai Gorge, but this doesn't reflect what was going on in the rest of the continent? So maybe this is a sampling bias, okay? We don't know the meat yield on the bone. So maybe lions ate the animals first, hyenas ate the animals second, jackals ate the animals third, and humans just got some scraps. We have bones, we know that there are bones, but we don't know how much meat the humans actually got to eat. We don't know about meat decay. We didn't have refrigeration back then. So let's say it was a whole animal. Let's say that our ancestors managed to kill a wildebeest. How long would they be able to eat that wildebeest? A day, 2 days, 3 days? They don't want to risk parasites and rot. So we don't know about meat decay, how much meat may have been lost. Competition with scavengers. So if our ancestors killed these other animals, if they were eating this other wildebeest, what prevents hyenas from coming up and taking the meat from them? Or the whole diet. Okay, so let's say that our human ancestors did eat a lot of meat. What else were they eating? What bias is that? What bias is it? That we see the bones and we don't see what else they're eating? Durability bias. There are bees in Africa that don't sting, and they produce a lot of honey. So some researchers believe that our human ancestors ate honey from these stingless bees. We'll never know, but it's reasonable. There are tubers. What's a tuber? It's a giant potato. Well, they can be giant. They can be up to 100 pounds, I think, that grow deep underground. And these are not going to fossilize either. One of the researchers I haven't mentioned yet believes that our ancestors got these big wooden digging sticks and dug deep and got these tubers and cooked the tubers, which would be like eating, baked potatoes. Very tasty, very nutritious. But the wood didn't preserve, the potatoes didn't preserve, so it's a good guess. We don't know. And there's no discussion of other period tools, and that's what I'm talking about with the wooden digging sticks. We don't know. We don't know what other tools may have been used that our ancestors were using to get food. Because if we just see bones, here we have I should have showed this to you on the left. This is a hand, like an axe that you can use for scraping meat off of a bone that have been found at the Olduvai Gorge. And this is a bone that was shattered. When they shatter the bones, it's to get the marrow inside, they believe. The marrow is very fatty. And also there's, I don't know how well you can see, but there's carving here. And carving here is probably to cut the meat off the bone. And so we have these durable artifacts. We just don't have it of the honey, we don't have it of the tubers, etc. Interestingly, I said we don't have those wooden digging sticks. We don't have wooden spears either from 2 million years ago. Or even 1.5 million years ago. So Henry Bunn, this researcher, he was thinking, well, how do our ancestors, because our ancestors 2 million years ago were still reasonably small, how did they actually hunt these animals and kill these animals? And he thought that maybe our ancestors went up in trees, they had spears, and like a zebra goes underneath and they jump on the back of the zebra and they stab the zebra, and that's how they're hunting. That's a fine idea, we just don't have any evidence of it. We don't have any of these spears. And yet, this same researcher criticizes the other researcher I mentioned who thought that maybe we were digging tubers out with wooden digging tools, and he criticized him because there's no wooden digging tools. And so this is kind of a double standard, right? So spears, good because it's my theory, digging tools, bad because it's your theory. Also at this time, as I'm saying, there's durability, spears weren't discovered in the area for another 1 million years. So spears were discovered elsewhere 500,000 years ago, but in this area they weren't discovered for another 1 million years back. He suggests also that we could power scavenge. Power scavenging is lions will kill a wildebeest. I'm sorry to pick on the wildebeests. Lions will kill a wildebeest, and then our ancestors would take spears and they would scare the lions away. Or there are other things. There's an acacia bush, which is very thorny, and so maybe our ancestors got these bushes, they took them out of the ground, and they were pushing these thorny bushes at the lions. It's power scavenging. So it's possible they power scavenged. They could also power scavenge pigs, who are amazing at digging out tubers. There's no equal consideration. He's got confirmation bias. He's looking for the conclusions that fit his theory, and he's dismissing the same ideas with other theories. Then we start looking at the chemical analysis, more physical evidence of what our ancestors ate. So we have bones from Australopithecines, and they show that our Australopithecine relatives had grass in their diet. Now, some researchers, calling out Neil Mann, didn't like that. And so he found one example, n equals 1, he found one example where our ancestor had grass markers in their bones, but they didn't have abrasion on their teeth, which is characteristic if you're eating grass. It's going to wear your teeth in a certain way. So his reasoning was, how does our relative get grass in their diet without eating grass? And he thought maybe they ate the insides of zebras. Maybe they ate the insides of wildebeests, and that's how they got grass in the diet. And he makes that conclusion that humans ate meat based on one example. But we know that our ancestors subsisted on grass. One of the other reasons is because Australopithecines had conical ribs. If you stand up, and you don't need to stand up, but if you stand up, you will observe that your rib cage is pretty parallel. And that's because our colon is pretty small, but our ancestors had a very large colon. And so the ribs went in a cone. So there's more room for the colon under the ribs. And what does a large colon do? What does the large colon of a horse do? It ferments grass. What does the large colon of a chimpanzee do? It ferments grass and other leaves. And so it's believed that our ancestors had large colon because they have these conical ribs. They had grass in the bones. And here I have the big colons for fermenting grass and sedges. Sedges is a relative of grass. So, we look at the bones, and the bones of our ancestors say that they ate plants, except for that one exception. We look at Neanderthals. Neanderthals are a sister species, a cousin species, not directly our ancestors. And around 10, 15 years ago, give or take, here we have a comment from 2010, but around 10, 15 years ago when they were analyzing Neanderthal bones, they had a very high protein diet. And you hear everywhere, where do you get your protein? You get it from meat. And these researchers are all, well, how come the Neanderthals have such a high protein diet? They must have eaten a lot of meat. And some researchers even thought that Neanderthals ate close to 100% of their diet on meat because the protein in their bones was so high. But after they've had these bone analyses done, they started looking at coprolites. One of my favorite words. What's a coprolite? Coprolite. Copro is another word for poop. Ite is stone. It's petrified poop. So some researchers found petrified Neanderthal poop in caves in Europe, and they started looking at the petrified Neanderthal poop, at the coprolites. And they found different markers of cholesterol and fats. And those markers of cholesterol and fats showed that these Neanderthals ate a diet of about 1/2 meat and about 1/2 plants. And that caused this researcher to say, we've tended to assume that if you have a very high value for protein in the diet, that must come from meat. But it's possible it came from plants. After she said this, these lines are a little out of order. After she said this, we got some dental plaque from Neanderthals because they didn't have toothbrushes. And they got in that dental plaque and they were looking at what was in there. And they found a lot of plants and some fat, some meat, some fat. In fact, the Spanish Neanderthals just recently are now believed to have eaten almost entirely plants, and the German Neanderthals are believed to be around 50-50, at least for those that were studied. So again, we have this bias of anthropocentrism, carnism, speciesism, and then as we get more and more data coming in, we have to analyze the data differently and get different conclusions. Talking about So that was more of the physical evidence. We're going to go a little more philosophical. There's the expensive tissue hypothesis, which was very popular until it was debunked. All right, so Leslie Aiello, she came up with the expensive tissue hypothesis. And her data was that our ancestors had a small brain and a large colon. And we know that, right? The Australopithecines, 350 cubic centimeter brain, and the conical ribs, the large colon to eat grass. Now, the brain and the colon use about the same amount of energy. They use about 20-25% of the energy. So whenever you're eating food, about a quarter of that food goes to your brain. About a quarter of the calories go to your brain. About a quarter of the calories go to your gut. So as the brain was growing, then the gut was shrinking, and this kind of balanced the energy out. The logical problem with this, or the scientific problem with this, is that as the colon was shrinking, there's less colon to absorb nutrients. And so if you have a low nutrient diet, which would be a lot of grass and a lot of fiber, you have to switch to a high nutrient diet just because your colon is getting smaller. And so that's the problem here to balance the energy. As the brain was getting larger and the gut was getting smaller, we could get more energy from different sources. We could get it from meat, we could get it from tubers, the underground potatoes, or we could get it from cooked food, whether it's tuber meat or cooked anything. The more you cook food, you break down the cell walls, you can get more calories out of it. But despite there being 3 options of where we could get those extra calories from, Leslie Aiello said, we got it from meat. Confirmation bias. Okay. My own personal hypothesis, again, I haven't seen this anywhere, but if you look at the first jiggling pie graph, these are our ancient ancestors, Australopithecines. They have a small brain, a large gut. Okay? From 4 million years ago to 1 million years ago, the brain grew and the gut shrank. And this is what Leslie Aiello is saying. This is a problem. What she didn't consider, and again, I don't know if anybody else has, what she didn't consider is that our gut is not just one organ, but our gut is, well, it's several organs. We have the esophagus, which doesn't really count in this context. We have the stomach, we have the small intestine, large intestine, and we have the rectum. So it's not just one organ. So what if our gut, if we actually looked at it not as one organ, but we looked at it as 2 organs, small intestine, large intestine, and so when it changed from a small brain to a large brain and a large gut to a small gut, the small intestine still could have gotten larger, which is where we absorb our nutrients, and the large intestine smaller. And so this would satisfy Leslie Aiello's problem of where do we get the extra nutrients? Because if we lost a lot of our large colon, but we gained small intestine, we could still gain more nutrients to feed our large brain. And this just wasn't considered. Again, we have a durability bias problem. We have no fossils of the colons of our ancient ancestors, so it's just hypothesis. But it's a fair argument, even if it's wrong, it's a fair argument. Another big problem with Leslie Aiello's theory is the fatty brain. That's what I was talking about before. The human brain grew, but does that mean that it grew more neurons, or did it grow more fat? Or did it grow much more fat and a little bit more neurons? And so where's the data here that Leslie Aiello did not consider with the expensive tissue hypothesis? And Anna Navarrete addressed this. She said that contrary to what the expensive tissue hypothesis predicted, they didn't find it panned out. When they were considering the fat in the brain, they didn't find that her predictions actually worked out the way that she said that they did. This illustration here is an example of what a brain might look like if you took all the fat away. There's a lot of fat up there, okay? Maybe more in mine than others, but there's a lot of fat in there. Catherine Milton brought up the problem of omega-3s. You've heard about the omega-3s, right? It's extremely important in the development of the human brain. And so her argument was that when a human child's brain has been rapidly expanding, they needed a lot of omega-3s to feed that large growth. And the only way she thought that we could get that large growth was, again, by eating meat. This goes back to one of her earlier quotes. But actually, not only could we get omega-3s from meat, but where do omega-3s come from in nature? They come from algae. And we have these African lakes with a lot of reeds, and there's algae growing on the reeds. And there's other edible vegetables on the banks of these rivers covered in algae. And so there's another source that we get omega-3s from, our ancestors could. And there's other plants. Tiger nuts, which I'll be talking about. Tiger nuts is a plant, and it's high in omega-3s. And so again, when Catherine Milton was presented with this problem, she said our ancestors had to have eaten meat. Oh, these are what tiger nuts look like. Down here, this is a sedge. These are very high in omega-3s, and baboons, actually, families of baboons have been observed going into a field of these sedges, and they're pulling up these tiger nuts and eating the tiger nuts. If baboons did it, our ancestors probably did it too. Got a handful of general contradictions. I told you about the shrinkage of the human brain. A logical problem. 50,000 years ago, full-scale hunting, and our brain is growing. It peaks around 20,000 years ago and it starts to shrink, and we actually lose the size of a tennis ball. Your brain today is about a tennis ball size smaller than our ancestors were. Why is it that when meat consumption keeps going up and keeps going up and keeps going up, our brain shrinks? That's the problem of the correlation and causation. These things are independent factors, in my opinion. Why do you think that our brain shrunk? Nobody knows, but why do you think?
Not using it enough.
Damn straight.
I was gonna say that to fit like the body size for this.
So it's energy conservation. So that would be saying that we don't need such a large brain anymore to reproduce, and maybe there's less food available, maybe there's famine, and so our body size shrinks. We can do the same stuff with a smaller body. Maybe our brains are being rewired to be more efficient, and so it doesn't have to be as big as it is, less fat, any number of these things. Some people think that we have shared memory now, shared intelligence. I don't have to remember everything because I can ask you. I don't need as much space for memory. Maybe that's one thing. And we can really see that in the internet age. All the information's on Wikipedia, right? So we don't have to have such a large brain. So there are some ideas why it shrank. But if the question is, or if the hypothesis is, meat caused the brain to grow, why is it that the more meat we ate, the brain started to shrink? And all that means to me is that link that they have, that causative link that they have, is broken. That link is not there. Some other contradictions. This is the Texas sharpshooter fallacy where we draw the target. We know the answer we want and we select the answer. Spider monkeys and howler monkeys both live in South America, very closely related species. Spider monkeys prefer fruit. Howler monkeys prefer leaves. The spider monkey brain evolved twice the size of the howler monkey brain. And so here we have two animals closely related. When they branch off, one has a larger brain, not by eating meat, but by eating fruit. So if a spider monkey can double the brain size by eating fruit, why can't our ancestors? This was actually Catherine Milton's college dissertation. This is what got her doctorate. And she didn't bring this up, which I'm very disappointed with, when she was presenting her ideas on the omega-3s. Because the spider monkeys, they need omega-3s just like we do, and you don't get it from fruit. Stephen Clark, I don't remember which university he came from. I'm not going to remember correctly. Stephen Clark talked about chimpanzees. And he said the reason he believes that humans ate meat and it caused our brain to grow, you look at chimpanzees. Chimpanzees, they hunt. They love the taste of meat. They fight over meat. And if they did it, then our ancestors probably did it too. Okay? Couple of issues with this. First of all, chimpanzees do hunt. It's true. But the amount of meat that they eat in their diet, the amount of successful hunting they usually get around 2% of their calories from meat. So you'll see this on National Geographic. You'll see on the Discovery Channel, you'll see chimpanzees hunting. But if you look at all the food they eat, it's only about 2%. Jane Goodall says that the leaders, the alpha male leaders, will get closer to 5%. They'll take meat from others. But as far as the average chimpanzee goes, they get about 2% of their calories. It's very, very small. The other problem I have with it is, why did Stephen Clark choose chimpanzees? We are equally related to bonobos. These are both our cousins. Bonobos, they're meat averse. You might see that they've eaten meat occasionally, but the amount of meat that they get is about 0%, very close to 0% of their diet. So Stephen Clark had a conclusion he wanted. He shot the barn, and that's where he wanted the bullet to end up. And he drew a target around it by saying chimpanzees, and he left out bonobos. I'll bring you a little more into current research, which is confirming what I'm saying. Here we have some potatoes. Cooking starchy food was central to the dietary change that triggered and sustained the growth of the human brain. And so the issue really isn't the starchy food. It's part of it, because you could cook meat as well. The issue is cooking. Around the time that our brain started to develop, it's believed that closely correlated, well, I'm going to contradict myself a little bit. The time that the human brain started taking off like crazy is when we started cooking. And so our ancestors had some sort of environmental pressure that caused their brain to get a little bigger, a little bigger, a little bigger. And they started cooking, and they got more calories, and then it took off. So that is the idea behind the food. The question is then, what's the trigger? Professor Copeland says the trigger was cooking. Maybe it's developing cooking. What other animals cook? Maybe there's something to do with the sophistication of cooking. Cooking, I would also compare to foraging. We're trying to get food, right? We're also trying not to be foraged. Our ancient ancestors were not how we are today. Our ancient ancestors, the Australopithecines, were around 3 feet tall. They could be carried off by large birds, and there were very large birds. There were very large raptors, eagles back then. Hyenas back then were much larger than hyenas are now. It was a very dangerous environment, and our relatives were small, and they didn't have tools. And so not only foraging, looking for food, but trying not to be food could be part of that trigger for a larger brain growth. And also there's some question about tool development. Some researchers believe that the sling was the first tool to carry a baby. And so we have the mothers carrying a baby in a sling instead of on the back as the mothers are out foraging. That's an idea. But most of all, it's believed that our social nature, our community, our language, our planning, our social bonds, it is believed that that had more to do with our brain growth than anything else. And this illustration depicts it perfectly. We have cooking, we have food, we have family. They're going to be looking out for other animals. We're going to want to eat them. They're bringing food to the central place. They're developing language. Part of the brain that was evolving was the Broca's area here on the left. The Broca's area is known as the language center. So society is thought to be the trigger, regardless of the food you ate. If you ate 5% meat calories, if you ate 50% meat calories, it doesn't matter. The point is that you're eating cooked food, you're getting more calories, and you're socializing. This is Robert Sussman. He says that Australopithecines, our small ancestors, didn't have tools, didn't have big teeth, and they were 3 feet tall. They were using their brain, their agility, and their social skills to get away from predators. What other animals have big brains compared to their group? What other animals have big brains? Anybody, like what? Does anybody know an insect with a big brain? You should cover this in class. The insect with a very large brain compared to their peer insects, ants actually have a very large brain. And what do we know about ants? They are extremely social. Crows, extremely social. Compared to other birds, big brain. Dolphins we talked about. This is a spotted hyena. There are 4 species of hyenas. The spotted hyena, largest brain, most social. And a note for the ladies, the women are the boss.
That might be a final exam question.
Final exam question. So my conclusions are, the burden of proof is on the affirmative. I've presented to you some alternative theories of how the brain may have grown, but that's not my responsibility. It's their responsibility to say if meat caused the human brain to grow, they have to prove it. I don't have to prove anything else. Correlation does not mean causation, right? A penguin's wings does not mean that they fly. If you're in doubt, predators and carnivores as a group do not have a very large brain. There is no evidence between the relationship between the history of hunting and brain growth. Just restating, just because we have wolf hunters doesn't mean that they have a large brain. Just because Tyrannosaurus rex was a hunter doesn't mean that they're out in space. There's no history of it. And there's no evidence of how much meat our ancestors actually ate. It's all conjecture. When meat has been the most available, last 20,000 years, our brain's been shrinking. Brain growth, gut shrinkage, lengthening of the small intestine are explained by high-calorie food, no matter the source. Carbohydrates are the better candidate. So think about it, if you're digging a tuber out of the ground, you're probably not going to have as much competition from hyenas than if you're trying to take a wildebeest from them. The areas of the brain growth, the areas of the brain that grew the most correspond to social skills, of which foraging behaviors are one, and of which eating meat is one. And so to suggest that the whole brain grew because of a smaller and smaller, and like there's one skill set, eating meat, it's ridiculous. And there we have it. Thank you. I would love to take Q&A. If you come up with a question later on and you would like to ask me, my email address, jerry@lawofficejdf, which is my initials, .com. jerry@lawofficejdf.com. Questions? Please.